Welcome to another episode of Software Explorations, Concept and Overviews, hosted by yours truly, Tech Coach Ralph, where we are engineered to win. In today's episode, we are going to continue on our Docker series. We're going to get into part two, right? So let's not waste any time. Let's get straight into it. All right. So like I said, we are on part two of our Docker series. All right. So a quick recap. Last week in part one, we went over what is containerization. We said why is containerization important, how Docker plays a role in that, the key components of Docker, what virtualization is, and how that differs from what Docker does and what containerization is. We spoke about the Docker architecture, the Docker images, and Docker containers. If you did not have a chance to check out part one, then you can click the button that's going to pop up right here somewhere. And you can watch that and you can get caught up. But we are going to get into part two. In our agenda for today, we're going to talk about managing containers, what is Docker Compose, how Docker networking works, what are Docker volumes, the Dockerfile, and what that's used for. And then we are going to conclude our series for today. And then we'll pick up into part three next week, which would be our final part. Right. So, what about managing containers? So, when you're managing containers, there's a way you can create a Docker container, right? And to create a Docker container is based off creating a from a existing Docker image. You can create a container. The image you can take that as the blueprint of the baseline of what the container is going to have, and then once you get the container set up, you can put in whatever you can customize the container to make it simple, right? And then you can see the container status. There's a command line prompt to do that, where you do docker ps and you can see the running containers. You could do docker ps -a and you can see all the containers, right? You can manage the container lifecycle by creating it, starting it, stopping it, removing it. There's many different commands. We're not going to get into each command because that would be a whole entire Docker course, and there are plenty of those out there. So we're just giving a overview on Docker and its usefulness. There's ways to access the container logs where you can see what is happening on a container or what has happened on a container. So you can definitely get into that. Those logs are super useful to troubleshooting and things of that nature. You can execute commands inside of the container. So once you have a container up and running, you can pretty much log into that container and then you can execute different commands for whatever the case may be. If you are a QA engineer, you can log in there and you can kick off certain tests. So many different options. There's Docker containers to run web servers. So like the possibilities are endless with Docker, right? You can manage your Docker container resources to see what's going on. You can set up like the amount of memory that's on there. You can connect how much you can connect different volumes, which we'll get into later. But that's the storage, right? You can copy files to and from the Docker container, so you can have a local file on your computer, and then you can say to put that inside the container to do XYZ with it. Then there's networking and ports in Docker where you can say, okay, these like you can have the Docker containers communicate to each other. You can have the Docker container communicate to the outside world. You can say, all right, with this Docker container, how is it going to access the outside world? On which port, and how is the outside world going to get inside a Docker container as well? And then lastly, data management, which is related to the Docker volumes, is how is data shared across that container, inside that container. If you need to upgrade the container, right, you could create a new container and point it to the same volume, and then with a newer version of whatever image or software, while that data persists across different containers. Right. So let's get into Docker Compose. It is a very important tool, right? And let's read it real quick. Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container Docker applications. It allows you to specify the services, networks, and volumes that make up your application in a single file. Often referred to as a Docker Compose YAML.yml file. Docker Compose simplifies the process of running and managing complex applications consisting of multiple containers. And you can think about the Docker Compose file as an automation file, an automated tool for setting up multiple Docker containers, meaning that you can pretty much say, all right, I need a in this application that I'm using, right? I need a Docker container that's going to be running a web server. I need a Docker container that's going to be running a database. You might need another Docker container for something else, right? If you saw the live stream where we're working on the Airflow project, that Docker Compose file was huge. It had to set up Airflow, to set up MongoDB, to set up what's the other? I think forgot the name of the other database. I think it's Redis, right? So many. It was so many different components to it. There was one setting up the Selenium grid. It's so many different components that if you were to try to set it up manually with the networking and all of that, it would take forever, and you'd probably get something wrong in there. But with the Docker Compose, you can have that whole file in there, and then you can call the command for Docker Compose up, and it's going to try to execute that YAML file that has all of the instructions. And if something goes wrong in there, you get an error, and then you can tear it down and you can make your adjustments. But let's say you make an error trying to set the whole thing up manually, it's going to be a nightmare, and it's just going to be so much of a headache trying to set up the networking and the storage volumes and how everything interacts with each other is just a mess. So yeah, Docker Compose file is super super important. So let's talk about Docker networking for a second. Docker networking is about connecting containers, whether they're on the same host or spread across multiple machines. It's like setting up different types of communication paths, like talking to neighbors over the fence or connecting to the outside world through your home network. Docker provides the tools to configure these connections, making it easier for containers to work together and interact with the broader network environment. So, like I was saying earlier, it's just about the Docker containers being able to communicate with one another and to the outside world, as well as the outside world being able to communicate with the Docker container. There's a multitude of reasons that you would need to do that, but especially like when Docker containers connecting to one another, that is so important because if they can't connect to one another, then what you have in your Docker Compose file, they're not going to be able to like you're not going to be able to connect to the database and write to the database or pull information from the database if you don't have your networking properly set up. And that's a whole monster in itself that maybe I do want to get more into Docker to be able to better support it and configure it. So we will most likely get into the nitty gritty at some point, most likely on a live stream, on a software exploration live stream, where we're getting more familiar with the Docker compose file, the networking, the volumes, and which we're going to get into in a little bit, the Docker file as well. All right. So volumes. Think of volumes as a special folder that lives outside your containers, kind of like shared folders on a computer network. These folders are used to keep important stuff that your containers might need, like files, databases, or configuration information. Docker volumes help you keep your data safe, share it with other parts of your project, and easily manage it, kind of like special folders for your containers, right? And that just means that for a Docker volume, you have like it's pretty much having a file system for your Docker container and has everything in there. And Docker container can go and pull the data, whether like I said, it's configuration information, database information, whatever files it might need, and able to do what it has to do, right? If you, for instance, if you have a web server and you need to serve the website files, you can have the website files in a Docker volume. And then let's say you need to upgrade it, like, for example, like we gave earlier. So now you can tear down the container, create a new container with the most recent version of the image or of the software, whatever, and you can say use this existing Docker container, and then once that happens, it will have the latest and greatest software, still using your existing data. I used to use the Docker volume when working on automated tests using Jenkins, and I would need to upgrade Jenkins to the latest version. So all I would have to do, create a new container with the latest version of Jenkins, and then I would say, hey, container, use this Docker volume that has the existing data in there. And then I would just bring down the old container. And now on the newest container with the latest version of Jenkins, all my data is there. My login information, I can continue to log in, do everything that I need to do with no worries at all. All right. Now, let's get into the Docker file. A Docker file is a text document that contains instructions for building a Docker image, right? So let's differentiate like we did last week, a Docker image versus a Docker container. Docker image is the baseline of what your container is going to be built on. You do not run an image, you run a container, and that container is built based off a Docker image, right? So it's like a recipe that tells Docker how to create a specific environment or application with all its dependencies. Docker images are the blueprint, like I said earlier, the blueprint for creating Docker containers. And a Docker file is a set of instructions that defines what goes into the image. And I will show an example of a Docker file as well. We use a lot of it on Chaos Camp when we are trying to set up when we're trying to set up these challenges so that you can have the application running locally via Docker. And it's great because you get to use Docker and see it in action. So when you end up having to use it in a real world situation, you're not like a deer in the headlights. Right, so Docker file, let's continue. A typical Docker file includes the following elements. It has the base image, right? So for instance, in the example we'll be showing, it'll have Nginx as the base image, has the instructions of what to do, the working directory of that image, and then the ports to expose so that it can be able to set up so once the container is running, it can be able to set up the communication protocols, and then it has the running commands of like when you do create that container and you start the container up, what commands to execute, so your container can be working as proper as expected. But remember, the Docker file creates a Docker image, not a Docker container. So Docker file creates Docker image, Docker compose creates Docker containers based off, and that can be based off the image generated from the Docker file, or it can be from pre-existing images when the Docker compose is creating the containers. Right. So we are going to get into a quick example of the Docker file. We're going to use an example from Chaos Camp. I have the link in the presentation. If you are a member of the Patreon, then all of these presentations that I show are available to you. Just go into the Patreon and you can be at the lowest tier of membership. You will be able to get these presentations, do whatever you want with it, modify it, copy the content into your own presentation. Maybe you have something to do for work and you want to have a presentation that's at a good starting point for you. Feel free to take it and do all of that, right? So for the Patreon members, these are available. And I will put a link in the description to the Docker file that we have at Chaos Camp. And you can have you can see the example of how the Docker file is set up. But let's get into looking at this actual example. All right, so let's go through this real quick, right? This Docker file, it's saying from use the Nginx image from Docker Hub. So from Nginx, and the operating system I believe would be Alpine, the version of Linux. I believe that is but it's using Nginx, right? This is the image, Nginx Alpine, right? So from this image, right, I want to copy this dot index so this index.html file. I want to copy it to this folder, usr share nginx html index.html, right? So and I am totally not familiar with Nginx, but I can tell that what this is saying is inside of this, the web files, the website would go inside of this HTML folder on this path, and once you go there, then the page would load once the container is running, right? So this is just creating an image for the for the it's creating an image based off this nginx, and it's copying this index.html file. So if we were to take a quick look, it's copying this file right here, right? This HTML file. It's copying this file into, so it's going to copy that into this path once it's creating the image, right? And then it's saying open port, so expose port 80. So now the image is going to say, all right, so port 80 is how you're going to be accessing this HTML content, which port 80 is typically the port that websites are served on, all right? And then to the command, once the container started, is going to be nginx dash g and daemon off, right? So this command is what's going. So once you do like docker run and the name of the image, right? Then it's going to so the image is already so the image is already going to be created with all of this, right? And once you do the docker run, and then docker run the name of the image, so it's going to create the container. Then it's going to run this command nginx dash g daemon off, and now that's going to start the container with with, and you can access that container by going to the path of the container. Like if you're running it locally, it'd be like local host, and then once you're doing the Docker Compose file, not Docker, once you're doing the Docker, like once you're starting the container, you'd say what port to access it on, which that's a different part. I think we covered that last week, right? But it would go into that's how you'd access the container. You'd have to specify the port where you do like in Docker run port 8080 go maps to port 80, and then you'd be able to get into that container. But that's not the point of this, right? This is just to show how the how the Dockerfile is, and how it has the image to use, the file to copy from your local into the file to copy from your local into the image when creating the image, the port to expose, and then the command to run once you are starting up the container. All right. And let's see. So let's go back to our presentation. So let's see here. So in summary, for part one, we covered what containerization is, why it's important, what is Docker, the key components of Docker, what is virtualization, and how that compares to containerization and Docker, the Docker architecture, Docker images, and what Docker containers are, which we gave a very brief overview of the Docker images and the containers as it relates to the Dockerfile and Docker Compose. But in conclusion, for part two, what we discuss is how to manage those containers, how to build the images and the containers through Docker Compose and through Dockerfile. And then we spoke about storing data through the Docker volumes, and we spoke about like the structure of a Docker file, gave an example of it. So that's part two, right? We are going to get into part three. We're going to show some use cases, some best practices, the benefits, all of that good stuff. But if you have any questions about what we covered this week or last week, whether in part one or part two, please don't hesitate to drop a comment with your questions, and I will be sure to get that addressed. Whether we're getting addressed, whether we address it in like one of these, or we address it on a Tuesday night live stream during our Q&A sessions, whatever the case may be, ask any question that you have, anything that you're not sure about, and maybe it can even get its own dedicated video if it warrants it. Whatever it is that you need, we are here for you. So let's transition back to our full screen, right? And Yeah, so that's our presentation for part 2. I hope you found it informative. I hope you found it useful. Like, if you are in the technical field, you will definitely run across Docker, and it is better to get a good grasp of it now rather than later because when you are like, that's why here we like to dabble into different things early on. Like we went through Playwright, we went through we're going through Cypress, we went through we went through we're going through Terraform. All of these we're doing because we like to prepare ourselves early because we don't know what's going to come up. But I can guarantee you that at some point you will touch a lot of these softwares if you continue to progress in the field. If you just want to stay where you're at, then okay, I understand. You can go and go to work, spend your 6 to 8 hours, and then you go and do whatever else. But if you want to continue to grow, if you want to continue to level up, then you gotta put in the work. You gotta put in the extra hours. Gotta put in the time in the gym. While everyone is hanging out, you are working. Okay, so I hope you found this informative. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you know that every time that we go live. Like the video, share it with someone who you think will find it useful, or maybe you think they won't find it useful, but share it anyways because you never know. You never know, and go from there because that can be the life changing moment of what takes someone from here all the way to there. Okay, so that's that for this week. Um, Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, this has been another episode of Software Explorations, Concept and Overviews, hosted by yours truly, Tech Coach Ralph. Until next time, friends, this is Tech Coach Ralph signing off.
If you enjoyed the fascinating information shared in this video and you want more, be sure to hit the subscribe button to Tech Coach Ralph to be notified for new videos.